Hi, and welcome to Interprofessional Conversations, where we elevate your health and wellness through sharing knowledge. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your co-host, Chris Foreman, along with Dr. Giancarlo Licata. Today's guest is Jill Stowell. She's the founder and executive director of the Stowell Learning Center, which helps children and adults with dyslexia, learning disabilities, and other learning and attention challenges. For 30 years, they've helped thousands of students with a variety of learning challenges become successful learners. She is the author of At Wits End, A Parent's Guide to Ending the Struggle, Tears, and Turmoil of Learning Disabilities. She has trained hundreds of public and private educators in specialized learning programs and provides consultation and clinical support to a worldwide network of learning centers working to eliminate learning challenges. In this episode, we covered topics like masking children and its effect on learning, partnering with other professionals to unlock root causes of learning challenges, and what we can do to change our approach to trauma in children. Without further ado, here's our conversation with Jill Stowell.
Jill, thank you for joining us. I'm so excited about this conversation. I've been meaning to finally get you on our side here and have a conversation about what you're doing. We'll go so deeply into all of the insights that you have over the years and what you're doing in the centers. But let's start off with just talking about what are you identifying? What is the biggest challenge you're seeing with the kids that are coming into your centers now? Post-COVID, the beginning of school year, what's going on?
You know, the beginning of the school year is always an adjustment for families and kids. And this year, of course, there's so many adjustments because it was completely different last year. But the biggest thing that we are seeing is challenges associated with wearing masks. And I'm not against wearing masks. I totally understand the need for it. We work one-on-one with kids in the center and we all wear masks. But there are some challenges, and I think it's really important for people to understand it. We do a lot of work with auditory processing and comprehension and emotional regulation and attention, all kinds of things. And as soon as you put masks on people's faces, it takes away some of the feedback that we need in order to do all of those things. I mean, even for me, I'm really an auditory processor, but I have trouble understanding people when they're wearing a mask. Right. So then you take a child in the classroom who has auditory processing challenges, and already for them, they have to be working so much harder. And a lot of times they're kind of reading lips. And now the mask itself absorbs frequencies in sound, so they can't get as good of sound. Right. They can't get the feedback from the mouth. And so it's even more exhausting. They're giving up more quickly. Yeah. And, you know, if you think in terms of comprehension or social skills or emotional regulation, there's a lot on our faces that are cues.
Yes. I mean, there's so much to unpack here. This is why I think it's a great place to start. And again, we're going to repeat this probably multiple times in the show. It's not that you or I or anyone is saying masks are good or masks are bad. That's not what the conversation is necessarily going to be about. It's about, okay, there's some second order consequences to this. And we just need to understand that, because if we're trying to solve these challenges that are happening with our students, if we don't identify them, then we can't get to the core of the solution, right? So, right. Okay, so this is going to, I can go in so many different directions with this. We have to understand that sitting in a classroom, watching your teacher up in the front of the room is more than just a matter of my intelligence is either going to help me get an A in this test or not. There are the ability for a child to process all information is built on top of a kind of a hierarchy. There's a bit of a continuum. Mm-hmm. Right, in skill sets that are necessary for the child. And so so if the child can't see what the mouth is doing for the teacher, so that's visual processing, and if the child can't even hear very well what the teacher is saying, and there's some auditory processing, you're saying that's already going to that's going to take the legs out of this child's processing. And so all these other things may not be necessarily the core of the problem if those sensory issues are not addressed. So can you explain how should we think about a child trying to process information in class with masks on, and where is there this continuum that this is built on?
So that was so many questions.
So many questions.
So many
I know I can't keep. I want them all answered right now. But okay, let's go ahead.
So we think about learning like a continuum, and I'm sure in whatever area of service or healthcare that someone is, you tend to think, okay, I see a problem, but if I'm going to really address it, I have to look at the root of that problem, right? So if we think about learning like a continuum with, think of it sort of like a ladder with academic and social skills, school skills up at the very top. Okay. But underneath, there are all these areas of underlying skills that support being able to work efficiently at the top. So if you're trying to do a job at the top of a ladder and some of the rungs are unstable, then it doesn't mean that you are an incompetent person, working up there at the top of the ladder. But if some of the rungs are wobbly, you're not going to be able to put your full attention on a task, and you're going to struggle with that task more than you should.
Right. And so a practical example of that is, okay, my daughter is coming back from, this is now her second month of school, and she's getting C's, she's getting D's, and maybe she used to get A's and B's, right? And I'm wondering why. Well, how are we going to solve this problem, right? And I'm thinking, well, why are you doing so poorly in mathematics? Why are you doing so poorly in your English class? And you're saying that her grade, her ability to just get the grade is going to be on the top of the rung? Is that kind of a safe assumption?
I'm saying that what's expected of students, if you're going to work effectively at school, you're going to learn as comfortably and effectively as you should, then you've got to have a good supporting system. All those rungs underneath need to be supporting you, because if they're not, it's going to be harder for you. You'll have to work harder, work longer. Even if you are sweating it out and getting really good grades, it's still taking a toll on you to do it.
Okay. So the top rung, we now know that's built on top of things underneath it. Mm-hmm. Can you go into what the different rungs are that you've identified? And then maybe we can use that to circle back to where will the masks begin to interfere with the different rungs? Is that
okay? Okay. So we look at the very bottom of the continuum. We call it core learning skills. Okay. So these are visual and motor skills that start off, with primitive reflexes. When babies are born with reflexes that get them moving. Well, movement is how we start to make connections in our bodies and build our visual systems so that we can become organized human beings. And so reflexes jumpstart that. That's down at the bottom. But that core learning level it's not just reflexes. It's internally understanding right and left and being able to use both sides of our body and having body awareness and control, all of that. The next level up is what we call processing skills. So it's memory, attention, auditory and visual processing speed, language processing, just how the brain is starting to think about that information that comes in through our senses. The next level up is executive function. So those high level frontal lobe skills of being able to plan and organize and be in control, be our self-managers. And so all of those are the rungs. And there are so many sub skills inside of them. And every student, every person has different strengths and weaknesses. And so, when a student is struggling, a lot of times it used to be that people would think they weren't very smart. But the reality is, if you look at the population of students that are dyslexic, ADHD, students with learning differences or diagnosed learning disabilities, those are really smart kids. Yeah. But there are some of those underlying skills that are not supporting them well enough.
Yeah, yeah. So then, so if there are, roughly speaking, these 4 rungs, right? Is that correct?
We look at it as core learning, processing, executive function, basic academics, so reading, writing, spelling, math, and then higher level, about 4th grade on through the rest of your life, all of that learning that goes on up there, content, all of the things that you learn.
I see. Great. So then where does, if we circle back to the masks, and again, we're just using it because that's what a lot of us are dealing with, both as parents and as professionals. Where do you see this affecting it? Is this mostly then in the processing side of the rungs?
It's interesting because really it can affect every level. If you think about at that core level, there are kids that have sensory issues. So then they're wearing a mask and it starts to itch and bother them. And now they're wiggling and now they look like they're sort of, like irritated in their skin. Yes. And so they can't pay attention very well. And then at the processing level, certainly auditory processing is impacted. And also, if you think from a social emotional side, you cover your face, and some students really need that visual cue to know how someone is feeling about them or responding to them. So there's a lot of that messaging that is lost too.
We see a lot of cases that we talk about, again, dysregulation, the inability for the brain and nervous system to just feel that the internal world and the external world is safe, right? It's safe and organized. And so you're saying that, if there's a mask that is covering facial cues that may reinforce safety to that child, well, then there is going to be a dysregulation that's going to inherently be higher than if the child could see that the teacher is obviously smiling and is making, and feels that connection with the teacher. So from even just a regulation standpoint, that seems like that's playing a role. Right?
And you said something about, they have to, of course, we all have to know that we're safe. And honestly, I have to say, kids are pretty resilient. And most of our students, we have our kids wear masks and they do it and they're generally fine. It works a little better for us because we're one-on-one, we use headphones and microphones, there's a lot of supports, but then just from a mental health standpoint, there are going to be some students that now could be fearful because the mask says it's not safe, I could get sick. Or if their friends, are saying, well, my mom says I don't have to wear a mask. And, then, so there's just so many little pieces around it, and most kids are doing just fine. But when they aren't, that's just one more factor that I think we need to consider.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So you have not just one center. You have now multiple centers throughout Southern California. Can you explain a little bit as to who are the type of people that are coming to your centers? And it seems like they may be different types of people depending on the region. But what are the centers like, and what are you seeing there?
So our real target population, I opened the centers, the first center, 36 years ago.
Okay.
for dyslexia and learning disabilities, that is now referred to more often as learning differences, but a population of students that have average to above average intelligence, but they're struggling more than they should with reading or academics. So that's the population that we started with. The thing is that we work with these underlying skills. Our goal is to eliminate the challenges associated with dyslexia, auditory processing, learning, and attention challenges. So we have to address those underlying skills that are not supporting them well enough, and kind of creating roadblocks to more efficient functioning. And so we started with that population, but every brain needs those supporting skills. And so we have a lot of students who are on the autism spectrum, a lot of students who would be diagnosed dyslexic, ADHD, learning difference. We also have students who don't have any diagnoses. They're those kids who they are struggling, and parents know it, teachers often know it, but they don't really qualify. It's not, they're compensating well enough. They don't qualify as having a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, and so so if a child comes in and let's say is having reading problems, and the parents suspect there's some dyslexia, and so for some of our listeners who don't, how would you define dyslexia?
So dyslexia literally means difficulty with reading. The brain research indicates that the dyslexic thinker actually does process reading differently in the brain. They don't tend to be using the full reading pathway, so they tend to get stuck with just the decoding piece of it. But it's interesting because over all these years, we've really studied that area, and we've looked at our students, and we see kind of a profile. There are actually 7 different kinds of dyslexia, and we do test for that, but just sort of as a general profile, our dyslexic children or adults tend to be bright and very talented in some area, often creative, artistic, mechanical. They can really build and create things. They're Lego masters, and they tend to have kind of a 3-dimensional thinking style, so they can just see things, in their mind. That's why we call them out-of-the-box thinkers, because they have a bigger picture. And so they have this marvelous thinking style, but then when you apply it to 2-dimensional print, it can become really difficult to look at on the page. And then the other piece of it is that auditory piece, that phonemic awareness and ability to think about the sounds inside of words. And so you've got visual and auditory issues and confusion with letter symbols. And so any combination of that, creates a dyslexic profile.
Oh, interesting. So you're seeing that even though there is this kind of common term of dyslexia, which just means they don't read as well as we'd hope, you're saying there's at least 7 patterns, and those patterns can be, are they differentiated by how they test, or how they just, or what their symptoms are?
It's really based on whether it is more of an auditory problem, they have difficulty with the sounds in words, or a visual problem, they can't remember how words look, or a problem with the symbols, a lot of reversals, difficulty writing, can't write the alphabet, or if they write it, older students, they usually can write the alphabet, but they might have to sing it, they might leave letters out, their writing, can look very poor, not always, but it certainly can, sequencing issues. And so then you take the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, and you put it together in all different patterns, and that's how you get the 7.
Yes, because we take for granted that the ability to read out loud or listen to somebody telling us or reading us a story, or the ability for us to write an essay are all requiring many tools, right?
Right.
And those tools have to work in coordination with each other. And you can have one, two, or many
Right.
tools that are dysfunctional, and they'll show up a little bit differently. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so that's fascinating. So then, if there are 7 patterns, I'm just curious about this. 7 patterns was something that we now kind of have a shared definition of, which is dyslexia, and dyslexia just meaning it's kind of repeating what we're already saying. Somebody says, Johnny can't read very well. What does he have? And we do a lot of testing, and then we say Johnny has dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, well, what does dyslexia mean? It means he can't read very well, right? There's a little bit of a circular logic, but because
Right.
we change that, and it's not just you and I, it's our convention.
Mm-hmm.
Because we change the language of it, it somehow gives it a sense of like, oh, well then it means something. But by definition, the term is telling us what we already know, right? They can't read very well. So how then do you work with things like diagnoses and labels when a child may have a label? Is it sufficient for you to be able to solve the problems for them? Or is it going to be similar to the way that you see dyslexia, where you realize, there's some more components to this story, and unless we can identify the components, we may not get to an actual solution. How do you see it?
Well, absolutely. Each person is different. We have our own strengths and weaknesses, and so if a person comes in with a diagnosis of dyslexia, the way that we approach developing the skills they need might be completely different than another person. It just depends on what it looks like for that student. When they look at the page, is it easy for them to look at the page, but they don't know how to sound anything out? Or can they sound everything out, but they can't blend it together? Or they look at the page and they feel seasick because it feels like it's moving all over the place. We have to look at all of those pieces to determine what's really getting in their way and how do we approach it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really great. Okay. Now, so tell me this: how are we going to? How can we understand if somebody comes into your one of your centers and they have a condition? You're obviously going to go through some testing, but how do you decide? What is the testing series like? How are you determining what are going to be some of these core skills and what are going to be processing skills? What does the battery of testing look like? In a simplified version for some of us that aren't too familiar with it.
So we do what we call a functional academic and learning skills assessment. So I use a combination of formal standardized tests and informal tests and observations and input from the parent, from the student, to really look at, so we want to look at their reflexes. Do they have a whole bunch of retained reflexes? Kind of look at their core learning skills. Is there body interference going on? Look at their processing skills. So we have to look at auditory processing, visual processing, processing speed, working memory, all those things. We look at attention, different variables of attention. And it depends on the student. We create the battery around what the primary issues are that a parent is presenting to us, but we always look at these underlying skills. We look at the basic academics. What does reading sound like? What is their comprehension when they're listening versus when they're reading? Some students can comprehend beautifully, but not when they're reading. Well, that's not a comprehension problem, that's a reading problem.
Okay, that makes sense. So for our professionals listening, we have professionals that are, I always introduce this into 3 categories, and they're very broad, and there are people that fall into maybe a 4th or 5th, but some of us that have a biochemical lens, we see the world through chemistry,
Mhm.
There's others that are going to have more of a mental health lens, which is relationship and the understanding of the mind. Um, and then there's going to be others that have more of a structural or physical lens,
Mhm.
right? It's a matter of the brain and body and mechanics and fascia and all of those things. So it's a gross oversimplification, but it gives us a way to think about things. So for some of us that are health professionals that are seeing clients, let's just say, in my office, we have many clients that come for some similar things, ADHD and anxiety and post-concussion and a lot of concussion work.
Mhm.
We have a lot of students. So how does another professional see you, what you do, and how are we able to identify when maybe we need to this client needs a little bit of a team around them, and maybe they need some concussion work with
Mhm.
us and maybe someone else, and maybe once they've completed their course of care here, um, they may still have some other, maybe they weren't able to identify that they had dyslexia before the concussion, or maybe they're still having challenges with academics and they need the next step. How do you communicate what you do to other professionals to understand how to work with you? If that, again, broad,
Uh,
yeah.
Kind of exactly how you just did. I mean, it's like you're dealing with, you know, we're whole systems. Human beings are whole systems, and all of those pieces, the mental health, the physical piece, the biochemical, it all plays in and impacts attention and learning and memory, which, those two pieces are so critical to learning. And so I think, when you have done your work with someone post concussion, and now you see, okay, they've got to rebuild some skills, or they're still struggling there, then this would be a logical next step. And for us, we may be working, well, we saw this a lot during COVID, during the lockdown, where everybody was at home all the time. There were a lot of mental health challenges going on. And so, we, some of the things that we do address anxiety and certainly help self-esteem, but we needed a mental health person to come alongside to deal with the things that are not in our wheelhouse. And I mean, all of us overlap to some degree, but we all have our areas of expertise. And certainly, with biochemistry, I mean, if we're dealing with a true attention deficit, there's probably a biochemical factor in there. And so, we can't make those recommendations. We need, again, to have someone to come alongside.
Yeah, yeah. Who do you typically work with? What are typical professionals that you work with outside of your centers? And then we'll probably go into a little bit of some of the diverse tools that you have inside of your centers. But who do you find yourself working with?
We work with neuropsychologists who, because they are really taking a big view of the student and really trying to figure out the roots of the problem. And once those are identified, then they need to partner with someone to implement,
To do the work. Yeah.
to do the work, right? And then functional medicine physicians, chiropractors who work with nutrition and whole wellness. Um, and of course, we like to partner with Vital, because you have a piece there that we're really learning about at this point. But sometimes when we get these kids, especially for us at these upper levels of executive function and attention, and they just seem to get stuck. And what I've loved, as we've had a few students that have done the brain maps and everything, is being able to see now I'm probably going to say this wrong, but this is how my brain thinks about
Yes,
it.
yes.
Almost like they've got parts of their brain that are at war with each other. And so it becomes counterproductive for them. And it may look like they're not motivated and they're not trying. And when you look at what the brain is really doing, they're trying really, really hard. And so knowing that a tool like neurofeedback brain training could change that and get them unstuck, so that then the work that we're trying to do with them is going to work.
Yeah.
And of course, then mental health professionals, we work with also.
Yeah, because, and I think we have quite a few mental health professionals. We have of all groups, but I'm thinking now specifically our mental health professionals who work with kids and work with teens, and oftentimes work with parents of kids or the teens. And it seems like when we think of not just the whole person as a person, but now, my goodness, we're thinking of whole systems, which is the family system,
Right.
and the dynamics. You and I have spoken about some of the dynamics that we can identify with. Well, dad is doing this and mom has this, and how much is one parent's anxiety spilling over into the other child, and how is that, so it's all, there are so many layers, right? There's so many
Right.
layers, and so we can almost go to the other extreme from, oh my goodness, this is simple, it's black and white, there's only one problem, and I've got the one solution, I'm going to solve it, to, oh, there's so many layers, I don't even know where to begin. How
Right.
do you? So this is where my question is going to go. How do you see with mental health professionals, where maybe your clients, the kids or the parents, could benefit from support with a mental health professional? And then I'll follow up with, how could mental health professionals begin to identify some tools to help their clients or their clients' children to finally start making some of these solutions? So the first one, how do you think about when you refer, when you work with other mental health professionals?
So if you think about a learning challenge, you think about a bright child who's sitting in class really terrified that they're going to be called on in front of everyone and they're going to look dumb, or they are bright and verbal, so everyone assumes they can do it, but they don't want to, and that's why their work is messy, or it's late, or it's not nearly as good as when what they say in discussion. And so there's just a lot of misunderstanding around these kids because they look so typical and they have talents and abilities. But that, going to school with that every day is traumatic.
Yeah.
And we don't think of the word trauma well, I'm sure mental health professionals do, but at large, they think of trauma as being something huge, but this daily dread and trying to cover, and what if someone notices, and that is really traumatic, and it can certainly get in the way of a child progressing the way they should. And sometimes the misunderstanding is on the parents' part, or it just, the family needs to understand and embrace who that child is and understand what those issues are. It's interesting. We had on our LD Expert show today, we had Julie Lithcott-Hames, and she is just an amazing spokesperson for humans and for parents. And she was talking about how we have to understand, just because our kids maybe are getting all A's, but they have a diagnosis of ADHD, it's not like, oh, it's really nothing. It's really something. And they are dealing with it all the time, and it's impacting them, in ways that might be hard to see. And so I just think that mental health component is really important for us to all be aware of, and get families some support.
Yeah, yeah. No, it actually reminds me of a client that we're working with now who came in for ADHD. She's now in her 30s, um, and she does very well. She is an overachiever.
Hmm.
Um, and yet, what the reason why she came in is that she has to double check and triple check everything so many times, and it creates so much anxiety for her.
Hmm.
Even sometimes the simplest of tasks are so stressful for her that she's burning out. She feels like she can't keep it up. It's too much, and so, but nobody would have noticed, right? And
Right.
she keeps it all nice and together. And but she said in her own words, she said, but I feel like I'm always struggling inside. She's like, I just want to not struggle as much. And I thought that was an interesting thing because here she is, she's actually, you know, a very high up in a large corporation. And you know, you just wouldn't have thought. You
Hmm.
just you didn't know that there was suffering at a human level, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so, and she never talked about it because she thought that that would be something like that would be a sign of weakness or failure. So
Right.
now that's not my expertise. That I'm now, I think I'm relatively slow in that field, and so I'm learning to be able to recognize it so that I can, you know, begin to speak to that and then say, look, but there are other professionals who are very good at
Hmm.
helping to unpack this and identify it and work with it. And so, so I'm learning to see outside of my kind of lane and just enough to be able to say, look, here's, I see a need. Maybe here's another resource that could be available. And either it could be done right away with us or sometimes kind of in sequence, right?
Hmm.
One,
Hmm.
and then now you graduated, now's the next part. So I'm seeing that too, and I feel like I'm kind of late to the party uh, because a lot of our mental health professionals, I think, have been saying this for quite a while. That you know we should be aware of these things,
Right.
and this is, you know, so yeah, probably even more so now. Um, Now, how would a mental health professional then? When should they think about Stowell Learning Centers, maybe if they're working with kids directly, they're going to, you know, when should they help the kids and, you know, understand and work with their emotions, but when do they need some tools to help them overcome some of these limitations? How should they think about this?
I think one of the most common things that parents and teachers will think if they're kind of new to this issue, you know, if they haven't had multiple children with these challenges, is they'll look at their child and they'll think that they're not trying or they're not motivated or they don't want to, they're wasting time. It gets argumentative in the home, and so it becomes a crisis because they're there's fighting and tears and all of that. And you know, the thing is, kids do not want to fail. They
Mm,
are not failing on purpose. They would do it if they could. It's embarrassing not to be able to perform the way you think you should or your teacher thinks you should. And so when there are struggles with school and homework and it's starting to come up, he's lazy, he's unmotivated, he doesn't want to. I would just say 100% of the time. Well, okay, 98% of the time.
yeah.
There's something underneath that that's causing it. And of course, there are some kids that manage to get themselves into other kinds of trouble, but you know, our prisons are full of kids. There's and I don't have the statistic in front of me, but the majority of kids who are in the juvenile system have learning challenges. Well, then when you get those kids, be aware that there's probably something underneath that. Yes, there is the mental health component, and the whole family needs help there. But if we don't clean up those underlying issues, they're going to continue
Mhm,
to struggle and underachieve in school and, you know,
mhm,
have some of these other issues going on.
mhm. Yeah. Can we talk about primitive reflexes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because when you first introduced this concept to me, I I thought I was hearing something else. I could not see how primitive reflexes, which I learned back in chiropractic school years and years and years ago, could have anything to do with learning. Maybe walking, maybe their spinal posture, maybe some of these other musculoskeletal conditions, but learning, no. That it took me multiple times of hearing this to finally begin to see that there could even potentially be a connection. Can you define what a primitive reflex is? I pulled up a couple examples, and so we can talk about them if we have time. But can you define what a primitive reflex is, and then how it relates to learning specifically?
So reflexes are movements that happen without thought. And babies begin to develop some reflexes before they're even born that help with the birthing process. So help the body to do what it needs to do, to be born, and then to help them survive in the first months of life. And primitive reflexes, if you've ever been around an infant, or if people can think back to being around an infant, like if the baby is laying on your lap or something and sleeping, it'll go like this frequently. That's a reflex. That's the Moro reflex. And it kind of alerts them. It's a startle reflex, but it's a survival reflex. When they are in trouble, when they can't breathe, when that startle reflex is going to go, and then they're going to cry, and someone's going to come. And so we've got the survival reflexes, and then reflexes also get them moving in the first months of life. And as they move, like one of the reflexes, when their arm goes out, their head turns to that side. Well, that is starting to develop visual skills. I mean, it's just amazing how everything fits together. And so these reflexes are there before the cognitive part of the brain is really letting them intentionally move. They're just moving, and they're then starting to learn about their bodies and start to develop their visual system and start to relate to the rest of the world. And then it becomes trial and error, and then more conscious movement, and then automatic movement. It just goes through a progression, but it starts with reflexes. The thing is, if those reflexes, what happens is these primitive reflexes integrate or kind of disappear. By about 12 months, there are a couple, one in particular that might be as late as 3 years old. But if those reflexes continue to fire when they're not needed, or, a lot of times they mature into more mature reflexes. We all have them, but if they're not working right, they get in our way. Yeah. So, the typical reflex that everybody knows, the doctor hits your knee, your leg kicks out. Mm-hmm. What if that reflex was firing all the time when no one was hitting your knee? Right. Well, then you would be kicking people. You would be kicking the desk. You would be disrupting. You would be falling down. And so if you kind of think about that, okay, well, there are other reflexes. And if they're not working for us when we need them, or not working when we don't need them, it's going to create a little neurological glitch. And that gets in the way. Mm-hmm. And one of the ones that a lot of our kids deal with is the spinal reflexes, where, like, if they have tight pants on, or they're sitting against the back of their chair, now it triggers when something touches their back. And so now they're wiggling, and you say, oh, they have ants in their pants. Sit still, sit still. So now the kid stiffens up their body, and they're like this because they don't want to wiggle. And that affects their memory, because their attention and what should be going into learning is going into not moving.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. So it's right. I mean, there are multiple levels that I'm hearing here, because it seems like they're all connected. But at one level, if the brain has to continue to make conscious adaptations and compensations for these either primitive reflexes that are not integrated right, or they're persistent, then that's taking up RAM, right? That's
Right.
taking up energy and mental capacity that is not going to allow it to build new patterns on top of that very well, right? And so that, I mean, and that makes sense. And again, we worked a lot with, cross crawl, mechanisms, and helping athletes as well try to, improve their gait and their running. And why do they keep making these same repetitive injuries over and over again? Well, we had to look back to the primitive reflexes and see if those were integrated, and if they weren't, then we had to go there. So I understood that, and that's where I was so fascinated by this. Um, but I never thought about it as just being, just pure mental energy. There is RAM that is going to be constantly being used to compensate, right? Constantly used to compensate for these. The other thing that I think is fascinating, and maybe this is kind of, again, from our perspective here, I can shed some light on this. We also dealt with a lot of pain, and pain in neuroscience is, the sensors are called nociceptors. And what's interesting is that there's a phenomenon called nociceptive noise, where if there are postural, right, spinal issues, problems with the low back, with the spine, with the sacrum, the child is not comfortable in their
Right.
own skin, in their own body. They may not even be aware of their body, but their body is being, their brain is being bombarded with sensory input, bombarded. I mean,
Right. Right.
and sometimes they call it like the heavy metal. It's like trying to study when there's heavy metal blasting in the room. And so, and what happens is that nociceptive noise is still using up now sensory bandwidth that the brain has to filter. It has to literally say, we got to keep filtering it out. It's still shooting out all this information. And oftentimes, and I'm sure you see this, and this is why I'm so intrigued by this, but when finally a child's physical body is in less pain or more balance or more ease, you just see it on their countenance, and it's like they can finally be present, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And
Absolutely.
so do you see that as well? And yeah.
It's like once the body starts to organize and operate automatically the way that it's supposed to,
Yeah.
it's like they seem more mature, and they
Right.
begin to, they're more regulated, they're not in trouble all the time, they feel better about themselves. And it was just getting the body to, I mean, that's our foundation. And that you get a paper cut, and it can bother you all day long, right? And
Right.
and so, getting the body to settle and just be in the zone is really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. They say, or like trying to sit through, 6 hours of class with a tack in your shoe.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to be hard. So I love the fact that your centers are taking this into account. Right? I think that's just fascinating. I love the fact that you take it all the way down to actual primitive reflexes. Like, I just think I can't commend you enough for that. I just think that's so wonderful. And so how then, with the primitive reflexes, how are you addressing them? How do you address them in office? And when do you have to refer out to maybe some of these other health professionals?
So we have a passive and an active reflex integration, and sometimes we do it together. Sometimes we jumpstart with the passive, which is cold laser, and sometimes so we may use one or both with students. But babies integrate their reflexes through movement. So our core learning skills training involves reflex integration and many other things, but those are movement and balance activities that at first engage the student on a conscious level to know what their body is doing, and you know, do the same movements or counteract movements, you know, to begin to integrate. And then of course we're looking for all of that control, speed and force and energy behind what they're doing, to become automatic. And then we also use cold laser, low level laser therapy to really, in a sense, trace the pathways, the reflex pathways. And we work on 17 different primitive reflexes, and it is highly effective.
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah,
So,
no, and there are many corollaries in the performance world with cold laser, not just for rehab, but also working with, again, like I mentioned, gait work, core stability, integration of, and this is for pro football players and basketball players and so on. But they're also using cold laser on some of these spots because they have proven effectiveness with retracing and sending the right feedback to the brain to begin to break. It's usually breaking patterns, right? It's usually
right.
to break some aberrant patterns so that the nervous system can start to reestablish some of these kind of autopilot patterns, right?
Right. And you know, what we do is really effective, but there are times where the student is just stuck.
Yeah.
And it tends to be with our population of students that have severe dysregulation or behavior issues. They're in so much fight or flight that, you know, that you can barely get near them. And we have worked with chiropractors in particular who have done different kinds of therapies to help unblock those pathways so that we can get in.
Yeah, yeah. That's really useful. Thank you. And you know, for a lot of our professionals, we often talk about science and we talk about the importance of being able to have some, you know, evidence to support what we do. And what I often mention is that there are usually two types of evidence-based work. One, which we kind of always assume is the case, which is we can prove the mechanism. Like we can prove exactly where everything is happening and how it's happening, and that may be, you know, fine, but it's sometimes harder to do. And there's another one that just proves effectiveness. If I do the same thing over and over again, I'll get a predictable result. And we may not be able to explain exactly all of the mechanisms that are at play here, but we can predict it with such a high amount of you know, reliability that it's still science, it's still scientific, it's still evidence-based. And so, and it seems like at the end of the day, if you can begin to show that if you can begin to work on the reflexes begin to get to shift, and you begin to see the changes that are measurable in a child's performance, and if you have enough data, enough people doing it, you know, that's oftentimes that gets discounted, but I don't think it should. I think that's very valid. So, and I know that you've got 34 years of of data behind you. So that's wonderful. That's great. So for other people that are interested in learning more about primitive reflexes, or other educational therapists, or you know, we have a lot of even, you know, just overall people that are dealing with children in any aspect. Do you have anywhere to point them? Any resources? Any insight, or should we just add them later on in the show notes?
I learned from a number of different people, and you know, some of the people in this area were doing the work a long time ago. But in terms of our cold laser work, that was developed by Bonnie Brandis, and it's called quantum reflex integration. I actually, you know, a lot of the primitive reflex work came out of developmental optometry. And so a lot of people that I learned from were in the field of developmental optometry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. That's good to know. Wonderful. Um, Great. Can we move up the rung? Can we go
Sure.
to processing? So we were, and I know that primitive reflexes weren't the only thing on the bottom rung, but the next rung up, you talked about visual and sensory processing, and we started this conversation around the masks and how those are obviously going to impact both of those. How do you test for visual and auditory processing, or what are just some general concepts for us that aren't familiar with it?
So with auditory processing, some of the kinds of things that you would see would be someone they're saying, huh, what? And it's all that it's a lot. It's not just once. We all do that once in a while, but repeatedly they need things said again. They, kids ask a question that the teacher just answered.
Oh, yeah.
They mispronounce words, or they mishear you. They think that you said something and you actually said something else. So there's symptoms like that functionally that you might see. We look at auditory processing in a lot of different ways to really diagnose auditory processing deficit or disorder. You should go to an audiologist, and you have to find an audiologist that specializes in that, because not all do. But we look at it in different ways. We look at listening skills. We have a questionnaire that we ask parents that's very detailed, because listening impacts energy and behavior and so many different things. We do the SCAN test, which is an auditory processing test. And then we look at components of auditory processing. With visual processing, again, there are different aspects of it. We look at neurotiming, which with dyslexic students, there is a neurotiming component that Dr. Terry Lawton has developed a program called it's called PATH, Perceptual Attention Therapy, but she really developed it originally for dyslexic students who were, their visual pathways were not firing in succession the way they needed to. They were kind of firing at the same time, so that the eye didn't know where to look and got confused on the page. So we look at that. We look at, what it looks like when they're trying to read or write. Functionally, what does it look like? And then we have some other visual processing kinds of activities that we do. Yeah. And also, when you bring in the attention component, there's an auditory attention, visual attention, and some information around those.
I've heard it said this way, and I'm paraphrasing, but if there was a castle that had multiple walls outside protecting the castle, the immediate castle, and there were walls outside protecting the court around the castle, and then there would be a third set of walls. One person described it as, let's say if there are 3 sets of walls, the outside wall would be the actual mechanisms of hearing and eyes of seeing, right? So if the mechanism isn't working well, then you can't get the information into the other 2 walls.
Right.
The second wall would be the attention networks of auditory and visual attention. If I'm not even aware it's in my environment, there's nothing to process, right?
Right.
There's not even data, right, in the second wall. And then the third wall is the actual processing. That data has come through, and now I need to make sense of what that data is and turn that into information, right? Yeah. And so I think it's really valuable for even a parent to be able to think about, how to problem solve for their child, because otherwise it seems like there's no kind of cognitive framework so we just start going to anybody who says they're a specialist,
Hmm.
right? And they may not be bad, they may be the best, but they may not be the specialist in the thing that your child needs, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
so I love the fact that you are actually testing for some of these different layers, and that way you can tailor that child's therapy or care or training specific to the layer that has the deficit, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
I love the analogy of the castle and those walls. That's a great visual.
Yes,
And
yes.
and that's where you need a community of professionals, because we can't we aren't checking vision
Right,
or hearing.
right.
We're really looking at a different level than that.
Yes.
And so, we kind of need to work together to figure out what's going on.
Yes, yes. We have a few both neuro-optometrists and neuro-ophthalmologists in this interprofessional community. And so it's something that I hope they're able to see, with this conversation when they have a client who's coming in and just happen to find them, right? It wasn't a referral. They just knew that these people were good at eyes. That if they see that the mechanism seems to be working,
Mhm.
maybe now it's time for referral to maybe the Stowell Learning Centers or others, where you can begin to now look at the attention networks,
Mhm.
the second wall, and then the third wall being the attention processing. Because good, you checked one off. They got through the first wall, but there are others to be done. So I hope they're able to check this out. Let's go to the executive function. How are you defining executive function? Because I sometimes that's a tough. We throw everything in the kitchen sink into that one.
Right, right. Executive function is really your self-management skills,
Ah,
your ability to live your life in real time and make decisions and plan and organize yourself. And uh, so often, when kids are having trouble doing those things, um, there are really issues lower down on the continuum that are getting in their way.
yeah.
That is very often the case. Um, Sometimes we just have to recognize, our fourth or fifth grader does not have the executive function to take a giant project, and like the big state report kids had to do, or the California report, or whatever, a giant project, and break it down into small little pieces and organize it and put it in time. They don't have the executive function to do that. It's not that they can't do any pieces, and you should work with them on it, but parents are always like, I feel like I went through fourth grade again, or I went through fifth grade again. Well, your executive function was needed, even though you want that to be a process. So, um, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Have you seen in your centers, with all of the excess stress and fear that's happening, have you seen a decrease in children's ability to elicit executive function maybe this school year?
That's really interesting, because as we look at executive function, what happened last year was that kids, were at home and parents were right there. And
Mhm.
and as a parent, you just almost can't help, you know, hovering and making sure your kid behaves and all of that stuff. But also, parents were under a lot of stress. Parents are working at home. They're trying to get 2 or 3 kids online on different devices, and your internet's cutting out, and so parents ended up having to do, a lot of times they had to be the one to get everything together. And so that kind of, that plus the fact that in a classroom, there's executive function development going on that just happens from being there. The teacher says, you need these 3 materials, go get them, bring them to your desk, do this or that. And now the student has to plan in time and space. How am I going to do that? What am I going to get first? Where am I going to bring it? What, all of that wasn't present last year. So there has been a lot of talk among people that really are dealing a lot with executive function from an educational standpoint, that there is, kids truly missed a whole year of that development and got kind of dependent.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and there's talk in other disciplines about the role of the stress response to preferentially divert literally circulation away from areas of executive function towards areas that are more considered survival, like
Wow.
the limbic system,
Yes.
the amygdala. And so there's a lot of neuroscientific basis for the fact that a person who is in a state of constant high level stress and fear, their physiology is designed to divert resources away from those higher levels of thinking to just immediate, right, survival, right? Right here, right now, what has to get done. Forget about the future, forget about planning, forget about problem solving. We just need to be right now, right here is hyper vigilant.
Right,
So,
right.
and so that's going to be, that kind of circles back to a child learning during these times. How is that going to affect them? So, yeah, that's I think that's interesting. There are other circles, and I'm not sure if you've come across this, but with everything happening with Facebook and some of the hearings that are going on right now, it appears that another saboteur of executive function is addiction.
Mm-hmm.
I may know I may know that I need to sit down and do some write my essay, but if my brain has been so addicted to whatever the source of that addiction is, I just won't. My brain is going to go back always to the source of the addiction. And so with social media and some of the conversations around how that is becoming, there is an addictive nature to it that
Absolutely.
is causing kids to no longer be present. So I'm curious if that's something you've seen on the addiction side of things.
We have. It is not something that we have had to deal with a tremendous amount, but it absolutely is there with especially some of our older, our teenagers. They just go down that rabbit hole, and they truly are addicted to the point that they get up in the middle of the night and they find the devices that parents have hidden, or it's a huge concern.
Yes.
And parents need help to navigate that.
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
And it's not us that are going to really have the right guidance for them, but they do. That's tough. That's a really tough challenge because it is an addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, it is. And that's where it gets, we start to see there's more layers. Okay. How do we solve complex issues, right?
Right.
We have to use different tools than what we've done in the past. So I love that. We're very close. So so the next rung is the is this just is this academics? Is this just
so these aren't perfectly sequenced, but we put basic academic skills, reading, writing, spelling, and math. Because really, if you don't have that foundation, which if you have learning challenges, then chances are there's some disruption going on. And most of that happens by about the end of 3rd grade. So for kids 4th grade on up, if they're not reading well, if they don't understand how numbers work, if they can't write fluidly, it is going to get in their way. So yeah, that's that basic academic level. And at our centers, we're really working with those 4 levels up through the basic academics. A lot of times parents come to us because their child has poor grades or can't read or, struggling with math or writing. And we look, what's underneath that? Let's clean this up so they have the foundation to do it, and then remediate the academic piece. And then above that is applying all those basics to, chemistry and foreign languages and all of the things that you learn in school and outside.
Yeah, I love that. And then there's higher level on top of that, which we know that has to get built on top. Anything else you want to say about the higher level, or is that self-explanatory?
Well, yeah, the highest level are those academic skills, but actually, really, I put social skills up there as well, because there are a lot of underlying skills that can get in the way of social skills. And so, if you're really going to function well in school and socially and in relationships, then there's a lot of supporting skills that need to be in place. So
this provides a map that that is so useful for any professional as well as any parent, to begin to look at their child and see what are areas that this child can thrive even more in, and what are some of the underlying deficits that may be there that are going to sabotage all these other things that are going to continue to follow them, not only through the grades, right, but also throughout life.
right.
This is so useful, so useful. I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm so grateful that you're sharing this with us. Can you tell us a little bit, how many centers do you have now in Southern California? How can people get a hold of you?
We have 4 centers: Chino, Irvine, Pasadena, and Thousand Oaks. And we are seeing students on site, and we are seeing students remotely. So we actually have students all over the world now. And people can go to our website, stowellcenter.com, or give us a call at 877-774-0444, and just schedule to talk to someone, a free consultation, so that you can just find out, share what's going on, find out, what might be able to be done to help.
Yes, yes, and I've visited your center here in Pasadena, and I loved walking through it. I loved seeing all the different resources that you have, and some of the head. Are they therapists? Are they what are, each center has some amazing talented individuals. What is their, how are you describing them?
We call them clinicians.
Clinicians.
And
yeah.
We fit in that educational world, but just an expanded view of the educational world.
Yes, yes. Well, and some of our other professionals have tribes of their own clients, and they have kids. And so you also have it's not a podcast, it's not a radio show. What is that? Can you tell us a little bit briefly about that before we close?
It is called LD Expert Live. It's a live broadcast that we do every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific. And we have amazing guests like Dr. Licata. He's one of our favorites.
Oh.
But we have amazing guests in all different related fields. So that would relate to our parents. We talk to parents, and we give parents an opportunity. Our guests talk and we have a conversation, then we open it up live for parents to ask questions. So parents of children and teens with learning and attention challenges from all around the country join us. And we started it during COVID, and I have just had the best time connecting with professionals. Every one of them is truly amazing and has so much good information. So that's LD Expert Live. It's on Facebook and YouTube.
Yeah, and it is a phenomenal resource. Jill, I have to commend you on it. I've watched many of these conversations you've had with them, and it is true. It is an amazing resource for all of us. Um, Even we have Dr. Tamika Henry and some others that are in our community. But I mean, I was just blown away by some. I mean, even though some of the most recent, like Julie Lithcott-Hames, I think it was just phenomenal. So what really useful there. And then I just want to share one last resource that I know you have, which is a Facebook page. It's a group for parents with children with learning disabilities because of the overwhelming demand on parents. They need support. And so how do they reach, and we'll add all of this in the show notes, but I just wanted to point to that. How do they get a hold of that group? Is there, do you know specifically, or should we just ask?
It is called Mom Squad, and you can get there on our Facebook page or by going to Facebook groups, SLC Mom Squad. And it is a really great support. Parents are supporting each other. Lauren Ma, who works with me with LD Experts, she puts up just tons of resources, and once a month has a live parent support group where they work through things. And yeah, it's a great resource.
That's
SLC Mom Squad.
That's invaluable. Yeah, I just love the contribution you've been making and continue to make. Jill, is there anything else you'd like to share? Things that we should know about?
We would love to have anybody come by and visit our center. We would love to connect personally with others in the community so that we are fully aware of the resources there. So, we'd love to have you reach out, and Megan, our community liaison, she may be reaching out to you, to all of you.
Oh, that's wonderful. And we'll continue to make connections, because I think just you are a gem, and I think relatively new to the Pasadena community. And the Pasadena community it takes time to get integrated into Pasadena. And so I just love the fact that you're here, and I want to do my best to help other people realize what a resource we have in you. So Jill, thank you for joining us. Thank you for doing what you do. And we will include everything in the show notes, but hopefully until next time, this was just a joy.
Well, thank you so much. Always appreciate you and your work.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jill. As always, you can check the show notes for more details about how to follow up with the Stowell Learning Center. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.